Good afternoon or good evening, whatever it is where you are. I'm Katherine Prince, and I work as Vice President of Strategic Foresight at KnowledgeWorks. Once we get the chat enabled, we're going to be excited to know a little bit about you, your name and location and role if you have a chance to pop that in the chat. In the meantime, I'm very delighted to have you all here joining my conversation with Julia E. Torres about connecting through differences and the power of inclusive stories. Assuming that we get the chat enabled, we'll have a few moments as we go along where I specifically invite you to put reactions in the chat, the reflections, and then of course, once it's enabled, we'll be excited to see your thoughts as we go along. I'm going to start the conversation with Julia in just a few minutes. But I wanted first to go over a little bit of background on why we're hosting this conversation and how it connects to KnowledgeWorks. Since 2005, KnowledgeWorks has been forecasting the future of education, bringing insights from the field of strategic foresight to the education sector. And in case you're not aware of what strategic foresight is, as many aren't, it's a professional field that helps people anticipate significant changes that lie ahead and influences those changes to achieve their long-term goals. Earlier this year, KnowledgeWorks published our 6th anchor forecast called Imagining Liberatory Education Futures. It describes possible futures for anti-oppressive liberatory education systems. And in writing it, we collaborated with many people who held different kinds of experiences and various ranges of expertise in the education system to conduct the research and develop the content. And we're very grateful for their contributions. And it looks as if chat is up and running. So participants, we finally are able to have you introduce yourselves if you wish, sharing your name, your location, and your role. And we're also now able for you to make comments as we go along through the conversation. The Imagining Liberatory Education Futures forecast opens with this quote from Bell Hooks: "What we cannot imagine cannot come into being." Much of the work of strategic foresight is about sparking imagination about what could be true in the future. It's about questioning our assumptions about what has to be and considering what might be or what could be. And that "we" is really important. Thinking about the future is something that we need to do together. We need to share our experiences, our hopes, our fears, our questions, with the goal of creating something together. And stories, the kinds that Julia teaches and shares, are also fuel for imagination. That's why we invited her to join us to talk about her work in connection to the forecast. More specifically, there are 2 themes from the forecast that feel particularly relevant to our conversation with Julia today. One is the definition of liberatory education that we used in the forecast, adapted partially from the work of Raphael Randall, who joined us for a webinar conversation back in May. His definition highlights liberatory education as being rooted in self-determination and the right to participate in shaping the world. The second relevant point from the forecast is around social cohesion. In that publication, we identified it as being a prerequisite for liberatory education. And when we say social cohesion, we don't mean perfect harmony. We mean that there are connection and trust among people and within and across groups. With social cohesion, people would respect and value one another's differences, cooperate to heal injustices, and act on one another's behalf. Possibly most importantly, there would be a sense of interdependence and a shared stake in the future. We'd have that sense that we were moving forward toward a shared destination together, and that what happened in the future mattered for all of us. Stories and books are critical tools in developing young people's sense of self-determination. They do so by allowing young people to see themselves in stories and by helping them see people who are unlike them in stories. And the latter helps them practice social cohesion. For far too long, our education systems have not prioritized texts that reflect the realities and gifts of children of color, LGBTQ children, children with disabilities, and other children with marginalized identities. And children who do not hold those identities haven't been given the opportunity to recognize realities different from their own, which limits their ability to create connection across difference and to reflect critically on their own identities and those of others. Julia is working to change that trajectory and to ensure that every child can experience the stories that they deserve. And I'd like to welcome now Julia E. Torres, with whom I'll be in conversation today. Julia, hi. Julia is a nationally recognized veteran language arts teacher-librarian based in Denver, Colorado. She facilitates teacher development workshops rooted in the areas of anti-racist education, equity and access in literacy and librarianship, and education as a practice of liberation. Julia's work has been featured on NPR, Al Jazeera's The Stream, PBS Education, and many more. She's a current Amelia Elizabeth Walden Book Award committee member, a member of both the Book Love Foundation and the Allen Boards of Directors, an Educolor Steering Committee member, an Educator Collaborative Book Ambassador, and a co-founder of #DisruptText. Julia, welcome, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, it's always an honor when people invite me into their communities in order to be able to share my experience in the classroom and also some thoughts that I have about transforming education for the betterment of everyone. You're joining me from my living room because my office is a little bit in disarray, so excuse the things in the background on the kitchen. But I'm really happy to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And, you know, there's a lot that we could talk about today. We've got educational environments that are dealing with censorship. We've got young people who, from the perspective of some folks, are apathetic, and from the focus of other, or from the viewpoint of others, are disengaged because the way that we have been educating them doesn't match the way that they learn. And we have not been responsive to that for a very long time. The curated list has been put into the chat, and I'm really glad to see that because I worked really hard to make sure that the list was reflective of some titles that not only are relevant for young people today, but are going to be important going forward as we progress in the literary world, but also in our education system. Because we know that, you know, a lot of the books that young people read are presented to them because they are nostalgic. And there's this assumption that young people need to understand the cultural capital of the hegemony or of the people who are in power in order to be able to participate in their society. But what we don't understand is that adults are often not conversant or knowledgeable in the cultural capital that young people are dealing in every day. So we outdate ourselves, and there's a huge disconnect between what we tell young people they need to know and what they're actually going to need to know in order to be society's society's next generation of thinkers, creators, producers, all of that. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk with you about things that matter a lot to me and that I'm dealing with on a daily basis. You know, I'm teaching 10th graders right now in public schools. I am a librarian as well. And you can get my book if you're interested in knowing how librarianship has transformed my teaching practice and how my teaching practice has transformed my librarianship and ideas about librarianship, because the two very much go together. But one thing that I can say again is that I worked really hard on this list, and I'm hoping that it'll be a resource for you. So, do we jump into questions?
I think we do, and I wanted to start us off. We're also happy to take questions in the chat as we go along. Julia, my first question to you, and I'm curious if participants have their own responses to this, is if you could just share a bit more, adding to that great introduction you just provided about the connections you see between liberatory education, social cohesion, and the power of stories.
So, a liberatory education, Paulo Freire has famously said that the teacher becomes a student and the student becomes the teacher. And he has a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which there's been a lot of debate about that title. And he was talking about a specific context, which was really the working class in Brazil, and how he was creating a pedagogy that would be liberatory in that it would liberate their minds, not just allow them to be better workers. And so we, I think, still have a ways to go in the United States in general before we've evolved in the way that we look at education to make it more of a liberatory space rather than one that is training the next generation of workers. That's very much, I think, how we approach the process of educating young people. We tell them a lot of times, this will be useful for you later. This will be necessary in your life and in your career. But is it really? I'll be honest, there's certain things I learned in high school that I never saw again that were not really necessary for me in my life. But I had no choice but to learn them because that was the prescribed education. So that's kind of one of the things that Paulo Freire was looking to disrupt. And the notion of the teacher becoming the student and the student becoming the teacher really has to do with us becoming more open to the idea that we would be taught as adults as much by the young people as we're expecting them to be taught by us. Because there are many times when they will have the cultural capital, the know-how, the understanding to approach not only literacy, but to approach a lot of different subject areas, and they'll be able to contribute to the classroom environment in meaningful ways, but we don't give them the opportunity. And we shut them down often because the way that the school systems are structured is still very much hierarchical. And then you were talking about social structures, right? What was the term you used specifically?
Social cohesion.
Social cohesion.
Mhm.
So when we think about social cohesion, what comes to mind right now, unfortunately, is that I don't feel like we are in a very socially cohesive world, nor are we in a very, um, how can I say this? We're not in a very socially harmonious environment. And some of that happens consciously because humans are, for lack of a better word of saying it right now, um, we are the type of entity or being that very much thrives in groups. And I'm avoiding saying the word tribal because I recognize that that has some anti and or some insensitive connections when it comes to indigenous people. But humans do tend to stick with what they know and tend to believe things that come from other people that they know. So I would say that in the environment where I'm in right now, the majority of my students are 98% Black and Brown students. So I don't have a lot of work to do to prove to them my authority as a knowledgeable person in the environment. The opposite was the case when I went into the predominantly white suburbs. I had to constantly prove myself and convince those young people that I should be seen as a person of authority and that I was an educated person whom they could learn from. So that's just an indicator right there of our society and how fractured it is. I watched a really interesting documentary with young people recently called The Social Dilemma, and it talks about how social networks are intentionally polarizing our society and how we are either conscious or not conscious of how that's happening.
And it sounds, I mean, I'm picking up from having read your list and just reflecting on what you're sharing, that one of the ways in which stories can be powerful in this kind of climate is if we're intentional in seeking stories about people's experiences that differ from our own, as it can help us work against that deliberate fracture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It can, but we also have to recognize that I'm hearing from a lot of teachers, well, I teach predominantly white kids and they don't want to read stories of people who are people of the global majority because they can't
Mhm.
relate. So
Mhm.
some of our job first has to be that groundwork of helping young people understand the isms
Mhm.
and all of the systems that are in place to keep us divided from one another.
Mhm.
So colonization was a force. We live in an era that people like to refer to as post-colonization. I like to say that it is the new colonization.
Mhm.
It's not post-colonization. It's just that the work of colonialism looks different.
Mhm.
Our minds are being colonized, our hearts are being colonized. We value material objects so much more than we value experiences with people all too often. So the
Mhm.
experience of reading a book together in a group with people, even though it might deal with subject matter, languages, cultures that are very different from your own, that experience I don't think is valued enough. And
Mhm.
a key aspect of that is getting rid of a lot of our librarians in our libraries. That's happening across the US and the world, believe it or not, more so in the US than anywhere else. But, that's something to think about. Why are we devaluing libraries and librarians
Mhm.
and the very places where knowledge is held, curated, organized for future generations to, learn to engage with it? That whole thing is being dismantled. That whole process is
Mhm.
being dismantled, and we need to think about why.
I mean, and do you connect that shift in staffing, the devaluing of libraries and librarians with the attempts at censorship you mentioned in your opening
I
remarks?
do,
Mhm.
I do, and I would say that the two go hand in hand, right? Because I was just showing a political cartoon to my students last week where they were looking at Nazi Germany on one side and present day US on the other. And
Mhm.
the caricatures of the people, their faces looked exactly the same.
Mhm.
Only one was burning books, and one wasn't quite there yet, but had a stack of books, had Art Spiegelman's mouse in his hand, and then he had a can of gasoline. And so he wasn't quite burning them yet, but that was the intention. And
Mhm.
so when we look at dismantling and devaluing of libraries, specifically in schools,
Mhm.
maybe we are not saying outright to young people that we don't value everything that goes on in libraries yet, but the intent to remove libraries from schools and from communities is absolutely there. And it's
Mhm.
always the excuse of not having enough money, or it's the lack of information about what libraries and librarians actually do.
Mhm.
And so you would be able to see folks who decide to read the blog post. You can see one of the roles of a librarian is to curate information, is to collect it, make collections, and to unite stories by their commonalities. So I could right now, off the top of my head, come to you with a list of books that deal with incarceration as a topic. Most librarians can do things like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Once that skill set is gone, sure, there are things online. You could probably put in books about incarceration, and Google will come up with a nice list for you. It's not going to be personalized, it's going to be curated by an algorithm from what most people searched for. But
Mhm.
librarians are more than just curating books. I mean, the preservation of knowledge has value too.
Mhm.
And if you can erase knowledge, if you can erase events, if you can erase history, then we know that we are doomed to repeat it. And
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
going back to the purpose of this conversation, when we think about connecting beyond our differences, we've got to learn about one another's pasts.
Mhm.
We've got to learn the true history of what happened in residential schools and what it means to be Native in this country and to live through ongoing genocide. We've got to live and know what that was, not just a version that is presented to us by the dominant culture, but
Mhm.
we've got to learn about the version that a Native person might be experiencing. We've
Mhm.
also got to read books like there's an African American and Latinx history of the United States of America. Books like that are excellent primers for
Mhm.
coming to an understanding of what has happened through the history that you maybe were not taught.
Mhm.
because history was taught in a very specific way. As we
Mhm.
have learned, history is always written and taught by the conquerors. And it
Mhm.
is a position of privilege to be able to have your story captured for the ages in print. Not
Mhm.
everybody can do that, which is why one of the things that I've been learning about recently is that archivists are trying to create living archives,
Mhm.
community archives, which capture the stories of living people who have been marginalized, such as those living through housing insecurity, such
Mhm.
as the incarcerated. So archivists are now creating archives of living people to
Mhm.
capture their stories and give them some permanence. Because for
Mhm.
the longest time, their stories have not had permanence.
Mhm. That sounds like a really meaningful and important effort. And
Absolutely.
now, in your article, you provided a list of literary resources for teachers by grade level. I was just curious to hear a little bit more about your selection process and what you look for in a piece of literature to recommend. And also, if there are any kind of characteristics that the pieces you selected share.
So these days, I'm always looking for a story that is engaging from the beginning. As
Mhm.
a librarian, I do a lot of read alouds. So I'll be quite honest. They call them reader's advisory a lot of times in library land, but it's
Mhm.
where you are getting someone intrigued about a book by reading just the very beginning.
Mhm.
And so most of the books that are on that list are going to grab someone from the very beginning. Very few of them take a little bit of work to get into. And some of that is because I work with young people every day who you have a small window to
Mhm.
get them intrigued, and then they're not going to be with you.
Mhm.
So, books that are engaging from the beginning. I also deliberately chose texts that dealt with stories from the margins. So, that's going to be people who are either linguistic, ethnic, racial, cultural minorities. And when
Mhm.
I say minorities, in every immigrant community in the world, white people are the minority. So I
Mhm.
need people to get used to that idea that that word minority depends on context.
Mhm.
So you
Mhm.
would not refer to me as a minority right now because I'm in my house, and in the house I am not a minority at all.
Mhm.
Everybody pretty much is a shade of brown or black.
Mhm.
So, that's something that I want people to shift their language around too. I
Mhm.
use the word minoritized, so rather than minority. So
Mhm.
that is something that you'll see in the list are people from groups that have been minoritized.
Mhm.
Also, I chose books that have overlapping intersectional ideas, and I will kind of take the work of Kimberly Crenshaw here and kind of overlap a little bit. Thank you, Jesse, for that confirmation or affirmation. I like to think a little bit about what we don't think about here as much in the United States. And forgive me if this is an international audience. I'm still kind of figuring all of that out. But in the States, it isn't common to have young adult stories that deal with overlapping identities. So somebody is Muslim and also queer and also West African, and
Mhm.
we talk about all of those identities. It's
Mhm.
far more common to say this person is generic black and this person is black from this geographic region. And
Mhm.
then we assume that everybody black has that experience. So
Mhm.
it's really important. I think some of the books on the list, a lot of them are going to deal with intersecting identities. So the layers of everything that you've got going on, because I think that's far more common
Mhm.
overseas. You might have somebody who, I'll use the example of this beautiful person who I met this summer. Her name is Melanie Ramdashanbold, and she is of Indian descent, but she was born on Mauritius, which is off the coast of Africa. So she's African, but also Indian, and she
Mhm.
was raised in Scotland. Awesome Scottish accent. She's all the things. And
Mhm.
that's uncommon, I think, sometimes here for us to be open to someone being all of that and acknowledging all of the richness and complexity of what a person can be.
Mhm. So even when we might say we're finally open to listening to someone else's story, we tend to look at it through a very narrow lens in this country, it sounds like.
I think so. That's what
Mhm.
my experience has been.
Mhm. Mhm.
Great. We've got someone in the audience who identifies, yes, absolutely. You don't fit any of those stereotypes. I don't either. And I get so frustrated when somebody wants to not only put me in a box, but also say, well, if you're this, then you can't be this, or you're too much this, or not enough that, or why do you speak Spanish? Why is your last name Torres? Why can't I just be me?
Mhm,
Why are there all the questions? And, curiosity is a beautiful thing, but when it turns into accusation, or when it turns into suspicion, or when it turns into blaming, those can be uncomfortable and unnecessary. I was reading something recently. I don't remember what, I think it was an article about Meghan Markle, and it was saying that so many of us who have mixed race or mixed ancestry have at one point or another encountered the question, what are you? And
mhm,
I hope that we can move from what are you to how do you identify, or what groups do you identify with?
mhm,
Like a multiplicity or a plurality of identities. What languages do you speak? What
mhm,
places do you call home? Who is your family? Those are questions that I think are more inviting than what are you?
mhm, mhm. And
Any
here's you see Kate's question.
Yeah, yeah. When you're introducing a young person to a new book, do you have any starting point questions to open up rich discussion? So, one of the things that I do a lot is ask the young people to be the ones that create the questions. So,
Mhm,
I'll teach them how to create questions. And I'm not actually the one who sometimes I'll go in and shape the questions that they ask. But there are a few different activities that I could recommend to get young people talking about text in ways that are liberatory, or also that will open them up. And one of them is an activity where we'll put these placemats on, and I'm actually about to do this week. We'll put placemats or just an legal size sheet of paper on the table, and the person will have a passage or the first chapter or what have you, a few pages, and you get to ask all the questions that you want on this paper, and then we'll pass the paper to the next group and they'll do the same thing. In the middle, if you want to have a unifier, you can have a theme, you can have a character. So all of the questions will be about a theme, a character, a range of pages, something like that. So the
mhm,
placemats activity will allow for a lot of questions to be generated by young folks. And then you can go through and narrow the list of questions into which ones do we want to discuss as a class, or which ones would you like to discuss in small groups? Which ones would you like to write about? Those types of things.
mhm. That sounds really helpful for making sure that the young people are driving the conversation. Another question I have is that as you think about the world changing, the classroom evolving, what are some of the most fundamental aspects of creating an inclusive educational environment in your view?
In my view, assuring every child early on that you are committed to creating an emotionally safe environment for them.
Mhm, mhm,
That is huge. No matter what their background is, no matter what they might be wrestling with, whether it be mental illness or their gender identity or their sexual preference or their name. Some people change their names in school because they've experienced so much violence with name pronunciation.
mhm,
Making sure that from the very beginning, day one, you are committed to creating a safe environment for that young person, super important. So what
mhm,
are the ways that we do this? When it comes to a name, I will say someone's name over and over again until I'm sure that I've got it correct. And I
mhm,
ask them specifically, how do you want me to say your name?
mhm,
If you feel uncomfortable, another way to do that would be to have young people record their own pronunciation of their name. And they would do an activity where they say, this is my name. SpeakPipe is a great place. There are many places where you can get an audio recording, but just say your name, because I want to call your name the way that you would like it said.
mhm,
That's really important.
mhm,
Many people, this is what's wild to me, is that we live in a country here in the States and maybe other English dominant speaking places where people will attend 4 years of high school where they will take Spanish or French or German or what have you, and still not learn pronunciation or how to actually have a conversation with a native person from whatever country. That is hugely problematic, I think. So what can we all do to make up for that? Get Duolingo, listen to native speakers, watch TV in a certain language. Learning the pronunciation and really trying to get it right, very important. And it is possible.
Are there any tips you would add to that once you have established that basis for an inclusive environment?
I would say regular check-ins. I
Mhm,
like to ask on a quarterly basis 3 questions. I ask more than 3, but these 3 are always on every quarterly check-in.
mhm,
Do you understand how all of these activities related to what we are supposed to be learning?
mhm,
So the political cartoons activity, do you understand how this related to the standard? And I'll put the standard in kid-friendly language, but I will always make sure that they understand how what we're doing connects to what they're expected to know how to do.
mhm,
Then I will also ask them, is there anything you want me to know that occurred this quarter? So
mhm,
quarterly check-ins or regular check-ins, is there anything that you want me to know? And then
mhm,
I will also ask them, is there any person on campus who is your safe person?
mhm,
Who is your safe person? And
mhm.
if they say you, like, well done, teacher, like that's a beautiful thing. If they say no one, check in.
Mhm,
Who is your safe person?
mhm.
You know?
Yeah. We have a question about spatial considerations as well.
hmm So I have a student in a wheelchair this year. And so I make sure that I've got room. It's hard in some of my class periods because I've got 31 in one class and maybe like sometimes I've got 15, sometimes 22 in another, but making sure you communicate with administration. If you've got a student in a wheelchair, there needs to be room for that student to be able to move around freely and be able to get their journal if they need to get it, get up and participate in the activities. That has to be prioritized.
Mhm,
So that's important. And then in terms of visuals, layout, or design, I'm always encouraged on my campus to have depictions of the winners from various cultures. So,
mhm,
though the CIA and the US may not consider Che Guevara a winner, he's an icon and a hero to a lot of people.
mhm,
So, having that person up, super important. Researching, and there's one planner from Rethinking Schools called Plan to Change the World. It comes out every year. It will have specific people in it that you can put on the walls of your classroom to
mhm,
make sure that you are depicting not just people who were fighting against the man, but also just people who were examples of cultural uplift from
mhm,
whatever culture they come from. So
mhm,
that's really important, having a nice big picture of that person.
mhm,
And then also, I mean, in my classroom, I have Barack and Michelle, just because I feel like they're beautiful people and I feel like they exemplify a lot of great stuff. I also have, I've got Trayvon Martin, and then I think I have Rigoberta Menchú. I think I've got Cesar Chavez. I'm pretty sure I have Che Guevara somewhere because I love him. So I've got various folks who represent the lived realities and identities of the students in front of me.
mhm,
Another thing that's important is the language. For a long time, I would always put on the board before anything else marginalization, um, prejudice, stereotyping. I would put those kind of words. I don't right now because I feel like they can have such a heavy and negative connotation, but it's
mhm,
important for students to have those incorporated as part of their daily language. Like in this book, we see an example of marginalization or erasure. Here, those
mhm,
words need to be incorporated into a young person's regular language, because if we don't understand the language to dismantle oppression, then it can't be done.
mhm,
Another thing is that in Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul's book Stamped for Kids, she's got a glossary in the very back of the book that has all the language you could ever want. So if you're creating a word wall, then you should have some of the words from that glossary as a beginning primer for folks who are not used to talking about oppression.
And that emphasis on surfacing that language, teaching the language seems to connect, if I'm hearing you correctly, with the importance of making sure that there's a systemic view around the literature, that we're understanding the story, any given story in that systemic context, not just as an individual story.
Absolutely, absolutely. And having that language, many people have said that knowing what language to use is like the first step in dismantling, whatever we need to. So if I don't ever hear the word erasure, how am I supposed to know that that exists
Mhm.
or that
Mhm.
it's deliberate?
Right.
And how am I supposed to own my part in the erasure and
Mhm.
maybe not do that anymore?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's just one example.
Yeah. I was curious too to um, know if there's a story or a couple of stories that really helped you see yourself and believe in your ability to shape the world. And then conversely, is there a story that really helped you see someone who was unlike you? And audience, I'll put those questions out to you as well. So story that helped you see yourself and believe in your ability to shape the world, and also story that helped you see someone who was unlike you.
I did not really see myself in literature at all growing up.
Mhm.
Um, I guess I felt like, this is sad, but in my day when I was little, what you would mostly see is picture books with animals. So I liked Bread and Jam for Francis. And then there wasn't a whole lot for me. I found myself in science fiction and I read a lot of Piers Anthony.
Mhm.
So science fiction, of course, was the place where skin color was fluid. It could be green
Mhm.
or, or blue. Like, so
Mhm.
that's kind of where I went, was the science fiction world. And I wish more people made space for fantasy and science fiction in school, because I don't think that we really do a good enough job of doing that.
Mhm.
I never have. But I remember one time I got to teach Ray Bradbury's The Veld before, lots of talk about Ray Bradbury being problematic was out there. But I
Mhm.
taught The Veld and I just loved teaching. I still love teaching science fiction. If that was a possibility, I would absolutely do that.
Mhm.
But anyway, when I got older, so we're skipping now from my early years when I would read a lot of science fiction and fantasy into my adult years, early adult years, I found some poets and I found Jessie Redmond Fawcett. I found Alice Walker. I found the poets were really kind of where I saw myself. And
Mhm.
Jessie Redmond Fawcett was from New Jersey. She grew up in Philadelphia and she wrote for The Crisis. And so one of the things that I think people should do is research some of these marginalized writers who are of various backgrounds. Lucille Clifton, of course, was really important for me.
Mhm.
So anyway, as far as seeing myself, it was the poets that
Mhm.
really is where I began to see myself reflected.
Mhm. Mhm. And the science fiction, it's a genre that sometimes futurists like turn to as well, because it's a place where we, like you say, we can have different rules. We can suspend current reality and we can explore a different assumption. So, yeah, I see what it's vivid to me, kind of that sense of exploration that can take place there.
Yeah, I have like such cool science fiction books that I've stumbled upon too. I was reading one not too long ago. I think Micah Bourne is the author, maybe, but it was about this girl who is queer and black, and her job is to go between universes, and she lives in a time when they've found a way to jump between universes, and then there are certain rules. She investigates crime in each universe, but there's certain rules that she can't break, and in one of them she actually stumbles upon a version of herself, which that's a no-no. You are not supposed to interact with the same version of yourself. But then she uncovers this murder mystery, and like, it's such a good story. um and those types of things just like don't get any love in the school system. So
Mhm.
anyway, that's a tangent.
Yeah.
But connecting nonfiction to my students. So right now we are studying, I call it argument, persuasion or opinion, and propaganda. So we look at political cartoons. We have looked at the students themselves are picking opinion pieces. There's a great website that I really like called Class Matters, I believe. Let me see if I can drop the link into the chat. I think it's from Teen Vogue. And it's from young people just writing all of these articles about how students can't learn in hot classrooms or in um, miseducation. That's what it's called. It's a
Mhm.
column that chronicles what it's like to be in schools these days.
Mhm.
So my students are finding articles from a variety of places. They put them into the Padlet, which is I think you have to pay for it. I'm not 100% positive, but it's a site where you can go and have your whole class go and drop items in, and then they can upvote them, downvote them, comment on them. So right now I'm using Miseducation and Teen Vogue, and then I'm also using this website from NBC News called Think, which has a lot of opinion pieces. And then I also like to find articles from people who I really respect and admire. There's Think. I think Think has some really great writing, great opinion pieces. So nonfiction right now looks like opinion, persuasion, argument, but
Mhm.
going forward, it will also look like critical media literacy and using the databases that the district has provided for them to do research. Because
Mhm.
I do think that they need to cultivate that ability to research and like synthesize information into some kind of an argument. So
Mhm.
that's a lot of what nonfiction text looks like. There's also, let me find this media bias chart. I really like this a lot because this media bias chart will get them to consider how reliable their news sources are.
Mhm.
So right now, like I said, we're in the middle of the argument persuasion unit. Nonfiction next semester will look like creative nonfiction, so personal stories and poetry and
Mhm.
songs. So it will get people looking at how can I tell my own story creatively? How have other people done that through song? How have songs been used to protest? And then what is the role of poetry in all of this? So
Mhm.
that's kind of how I will work nonfiction in. And when I'm trying to do that, again, I'm shifting it from the work is on me to provide everything. We live in the information age. So now the work is on me to lead them to the places where they will get the pieces that are of interest to them, and then teach them how to critically evaluate, analyze, and then synthesize or create on their own.
Mhm. Mhm. And that leads me to my last question that we have time for. I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about this idea of young people as not just consumers of content, but as creators and curators themselves, and why that's what that means and why that's so important.
Yeah, that connects exactly to what I was just mentioning, where, you know, you don't have to be the one to have all of the readings ready to go, all the comprehension questions ready to go, and then all the vocabulary words ready to go. You can instead have the reader come to you and say, this is the topic of interest. Where
Mhm.
can I find more about this? And
Mhm.
then they can be the ones that find the readings. You're guiding them into the process of analyzing. They're the ones identifying the words that are strange or unfamiliar. You're providing the tools for them to then identify, analyze, incorporate the vocabulary words into their language. And
Mhm.
then you're helping them understand, what do you love about this? And then how can you then synthesize or create based on what you love?
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. Before we wrap up, I'm curious if there's anything else you want to make sure to share as reflecting on the themes related to this conversation.
Yes, I know that a lot of people right now want to talk about book banning.
Mhm.
And I know that book banning is it's a hot button topic. You know, nobody wants to feel like we're living in a society that was free and is now becoming increasingly less free for so many of us that fought so hard for
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
Um, so I will say though that the book banning that's going on, though it may look new, it has existed for centuries, if not millennia, for those of us of the global majority or those of us who come from marginalized populations. And what
Mhm.
it looks like is people who design tests or people who design curriculum not being well versed in the literature of people of the global majority. So they control the cultural capital that people have. If
Mhm.
I'm to ask your average, you know, predominantly white teacher in suburbia to give me a Kendrick Lamar song and talk to me about all of the connotations and the depth of the language and all of the illusions, they probably wouldn't be able to. That's a generalization. But
Mhm.
I'm just saying that's an example
Mhm.
of kind of controlling the cultural capital that
Mhm.
we all are ruled by. And
Mhm.
that has been an exclusionary gatekeeping method for a very long time. So
Mhm.
that's why people like me have had to work so hard to learn a cultural capital that isn't necessarily mine,
Mhm.
though I've got white ancestry, sure. Almost everybody Black in America does. I think it's important for us to recognize those gatekeeping methods and start decolonizing our own minds.
Mhm.
Start decolonizing and confronting what you don't know
Mhm.
about other cultures, languages, ethnicities, etc. Start confronting what you don't know and get comfortable learning a little bit more,
Mhm.
listening more, and asking more questions.
Mhm. Mhm.
Rather than saying, okay, the book banning is so awful. Yes, well, the book banning has been awful. The book banning looked like not having anybody that looked like me or had my lived experience for all 12 years of school.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's what the book banning looked like for me.
Mhm. And what can we do about it, each of us now? Yeah, along the lines of what you just described. Yeah.
Yeah. Dig into yourself. Do you actually know anything about the Monkey King and Journey to the West? Have you ever heard of that? If not, the majority of the Eastern world has.
Mhm.
They're as knowledgeable about that as we are about Cinderella
Mhm.
and Hans Christian Andersen. So the
Mhm.
fact that the average person here has never heard of the Monkey King, Journey to the West, any of that, that's problematic.
Mhm. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your sharing your time and expertise with us. So thank you for the conversation, Julia.
Yeah, of course. If there are any further questions, you can always reach out to me through my website. It's just julia@juliaetorres.net. And if you don't mind, I would love to drop the link to my book only because I think that it can be a help to
Mhm.
librarians in various places. I'm really hopeful that it will be that bridge between literacy educators and librarians. And I'm really optimistic that as people engage with the book, they're going to start thinking about the power of librarians and how important it is to keep your school library
Mhm.
and make sure that it is staffed not just by volunteers, not just part-time, not by somebody who's stressed out because they have 3 other schools, but it actually, the young people deserve to have a full-time, certified, knowledgeable teacher librarian in their schools.
Here, here. And I see there is interest in that book link, which is on its way.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it
Yeah,
needs to
no,
go
I
down.
got everyone.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks again, Julia. Take care.
Yes, of course. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.